9 competitors, 6 years of litigation. All of it over a noise a motorcycle makes when it idles. In 1994, a company from Milwaukee walked into the United States Patent and Trademark Office and tried to register something no manufacturer had ever owned: the sound its engines made. Not a logo, not a name, a noise. The machine that made that sound was not designed by soldiers, not by engineers, and not by racers. It was built in a wooden shed, 10 feet by 15, by 4 young men who had never built a motorcycle. One of them drew pictures for a bicycle factory. The company that grew out of that shed would become the only American motorcycle maker to survive the Great Depression. It would arm 2 world wars, ship 30,000 machines to Stalin, and come home a legend. And then it would nearly die, twice. It was sold to a company that made bowling equipment, mocked as Harley-Davidson, and pulled out of bankruptcy 4 days from the filing by a lender who stepped in on the last day of 1985. 13 executives borrowed $80 million to buy back the name. And once they had it back, they went to federal court to try to own the sound. This is the story of how a motorcycle became the sound of America, who built it, who nearly killed it, and what it cost to try to own a noise the whole world could already hear. Chapter 1. The Shed. The first machine could not climb a hill. In 1903, in a shed behind a house on the north side of Milwaukee, 3 young men bolted a small engine into a bicycle frame, and it ran. And then it reached the first real grade in the road and stopped. The rider had to pedal. That was the whole result of the first attempt, a motorized bicycle that still needed legs. They called it a valuable learning experiment. It was a failure, and they treated it like data. The men were young, and none of them belonged to the industry they were about to enter. William Harley was the oldest of the technical minds at 22. He had started at 15 as a draftsman in a Milwaukee bicycle factory, drawing the parts other men built. His closest friend was Harley-Davidson, a pattern maker, the man who carved the wooden shapes used to cast metal. Arthur's older brother Walter was a machinist who had been working the railroads out in Parsons, Kansas, and came back to Milwaukee when he heard what the other 2 were building. A fourth would follow. William Davidson, the eldest brother, a toolroom foreman for the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad. A draftsman, a pattern maker, 2 railroad men. Not one of them had built a motorcycle, because in Milwaukee in 1903 there was barely such a thing to build. The engine came first, and it came small. William Harley had drawn a power plant of roughly 7 cubic inches, a displacement close to nothing, with flywheels 4 inches across. It was an engine sized for a bicycle, and it behaved like one. When they finished the first complete machine and it failed to pull itself up a Milwaukee grade, the lesson was not that the idea was wrong. The lesson was that the engine was too small. So they threw it out and drew a bigger one. The second engine was more than 3 times the size of the first, a little under 25 cubic inches, with heavier flywheels and a loop frame that dropped the motor low between the wheels. This was the shape of a real motorcycle rather than a bicycle with an attachment. And the design resembled other early machines being built in Milwaukee at the same moment, because good ideas in a new industry travel fast. The engineering was not entirely their own. According to accounts from the period, the men got help on the carburetor from a young Milwaukee engineer named Ole Evinrude, the same Evinrude who would go on to build a fortune in outboard boat motors. Whether or not every detail of that account can be independently confirmed, the pattern it describes is not in dispute. 4 young men who did not know how to build a motorcycle asked the people around them who did. The shed was 10 feet by 15. That is the number that survives, because the Davidson family kept the memory precise. A wooden shed in the backyard, roughly the size of a modern parking space, where the first machines were assembled by hand. An aunt of the Davidsons, according to family accounts, lettered the words Harley-Davidson Motor Company onto the door. The order of the names mattered and was deliberate. Harley designed, Davidson organized and sold. The engineer's name went first on the tank and on the door, and the arrangement held for the life of the company. In 1905, they built 5 motorcycles in that shed, not 5,000. 5. A Chicago man named Carl Lang became the first dealer, and he sold 3 of them. This was not a company yet. It was 4 men, a shed, and an annual output that could be counted on one hand. What they had was not scale. What they had was a machine that finally ran the way a machine should, and a decision already forming underneath the work, that the thing they would sell was not speed and not style, but the promise that the motorcycle would still be running at the end of the road. There is a discipline in those early numbers that is easy to miss and worth pausing on, because it foreshadows the mistake that would nearly destroy the company 60 years later. The founders built slowly on purpose. They kept their day jobs at first, assembling machines in the evenings, and they did not chase volume ahead of quality. When William Davidson, the eldest brother and the railroad toolroom foreman, finally quit his secure job to join full-time in 1907, he came in to run the works precisely so that the machines would be built right. According to accounts from the period, the first production Harley-Davidson passed through a series of owners and covered something on the order of 100,000 miles, a claim that is difficult to verify to the mile, but that the company repeated because it captured the thing they were selling. They could have built more motorcycles, faster, in those first years. They chose not to, because a reputation for reliability is destroyed by a single machine that fails in front of the wrong customer, and a young company cannot afford to have its name attached to a breakdown. The restraint was the strategy. It would be abandoned, catastrophically, under different owners, and the abandonment would prove the founders right. In 1906, they built a real factory, a single-story wooden building on Chestnut Street, later renamed Juneau Avenue, a street name worth remembering because the company would still be headquartered on it more than a century later. Output climbed to about 50 machines that year. In 1907, William Harley finished a mechanical engineering degree at the University of Wisconsin, and the company was formally incorporated. The draftsman had become a credentialed engineer, and the backyard experiment had become a corporation. But a corporation that builds 50 machines a year has proven nothing to anyone. It had a product. It did not yet have a reputation. And in the motorcycle business of 1907, reputation was the only thing a customer could actually buy. Chapter 2. 1,000 points. In the summer of 1908, Walter Davidson rode into the Catskill Mountains of New York to enter an endurance contest, and he did something that should have been impossible. He finished with a perfect score, 1,000 points out of a possible 1,000, in a 2-day reliability run over broken roads, hills, and mud, and he did it without a repair crew. Other entrants traveled with mechanics and spare parts. Walter Davidson rode alone, fixed nothing because nothing broke, and posted a number that no marketing department could have invented. A perfect score. It was the kind of result that becomes a sentence a salesman can say in one breath. Understand what an endurance run measured, because it was not a race. Speed was almost beside the point. These events were built to answer the only question a motorcycle buyer in 1908 actually cared about. Will this thing survive the trip? Roads were unpaved. Breakdowns were routine. A motorcycle that stranded its owner 20 miles from town was not a convenience, it was a liability with a saddle. So the contests scored reliability directly, penalizing every stop, every adjustment, every failure. Walter Davidson's 1,000 points was a statement that his machine did not fail. That was not an advertisement, it was evidence. The Federation of American Motorcyclists' endurance win did for Harley-Davidson exactly what the founders needed and could not have bought. It converted a small Milwaukee manufacturer into a name associated with a single idea: durability. The company leaned into it. Where competitors chased flash and top speed, Harley-Davidson built a reputation on the unglamorous promise that the motorcycle would start, run, and finish. The early single-cylinder machines were even given a nickname that made the strategy explicit: the Silent Gray Fellow. Gray for the sober paint, silent for the muffled exhaust, fellow for the reliability of a companion who never let its rider down. In an industry selling excitement, Harley-Davidson sold trust. The company had organized itself to deliver on that promise. When it incorporated in September of 1907, the four founders divided the roles cleanly, and the division mapped onto their temperaments. Walter Davidson, the machinist who had just won the endurance run, became president and general manager. Arthur Davidson, the salesman, became secretary and the head of sales, and he began doing the single most important thing a young manufacturer can do: building a dealer network, signing up agents across the country who would stock the machines and stand behind them. William Davidson, the toolroom foreman, ran the works, the factory floor, the men and the machines that made the product. William Harley engineered. 4 men, 4 functions, no overlap and no vacancy. It was not a complicated structure, it was a complete one. And the numbers began to move the way numbers move when a reputation takes hold. In 1906, the company built around 50 machines. By 1909, it built 1,149. That is a more than 20-fold increase in 3 years, and it happened not because Harley-Davidson had the fastest motorcycle or the cheapest one, but because it had convinced the market that it had the most reliable one. The endurance win was the proof, and the dealer network Arthur was building was the delivery system. A reputation is worthless if a customer 3 states away cannot find someone to sell him the machine and fix it. Arthur Davidson understood that the product and the distribution were the same strategy. The engineering that supported the reputation was practical rather than flashy, and one small example from 1912 shows the company's whole philosophy in a single component. That year, Harley-Davidson patented what it called the full floating seat, a saddle mounted on a coil spring hidden inside the seat post, giving the rider more than 3 inches of cushioning travel on roads that were still, for the most part, unpaved and brutal. It was not a performance feature. It was a comfort and durability feature, aimed at the reality that a customer rode these machines over rutted dirt for hours, and it was so well judged that Harley-Davidson kept using versions of it until 1958, 46 years. That is the signature of the early company. It engineered for the actual conditions its customers faced, and when it found something that worked, it kept it for decades. The dealer network was expanding for the same reason the seat was sprung. Both were answers to the same question: how to make a customer 3 states away trust that this machine and this company would not let him down. By the early 1910s, Harley-Davidson was not only selling across the United States but beginning to export, laying the groundwork for a dealer presence that would eventually reach dozens of countries. But reliability alone had a ceiling, and the founders could see it. The single-cylinder silent gray fellow was trustworthy and slow. The market was beginning to want more power, and a rival across the state line in Springfield, Massachusetts, a company called Indian, was already building the twin-cylinder machines that would define the next decade. Harley-Davidson had won the argument about whether its motorcycles would last. It had not yet won the argument about whether they could win. In 1907, at the Chicago Automobile Show, the company had quietly displayed a prototype of a new kind of engine, 2 cylinders set in a V, sharing a single crankshaft. Very few were built at first. It ran rough, and it ran loud, and it made a sound unlike anything else on the road. The company did not yet know that the sound would outlive every machine it ever bolted that engine into. It only knew that the future was not 1 cylinder. It was 2. And the fight to prove it would be settled the way every argument in this business was settled in those years. Not in a boardroom, but on a racetrack. Chapter 3. The Wrecking Crew. By 1914, Harley-Davidson had built a factory racing team, and within a few years the newspapers had given it a name that the company did not choose and did not discourage: the Wrecking Crew. On the board tracks, steeply banked wooden ovals built out of 2x4s, where riders circled at speeds that killed men regularly, the Milwaukee team began to win, and then began to dominate. This was a reversal of everything the company had stood for a decade earlier. The silent gray fellow had been sober and slow. The racing machines were neither. And the reversal was deliberate, because the founders had understood something about their market that the reliability argument alone could not deliver. Racing sold motorcycles. In the 19-teens, a win on Saturday moved machines off the showroom floor on Monday, and the company that owned the podium owned the customer's imagination. Harley-Davidson had resisted factory racing for years, letting Indian and Excelsior spend the money and take the risks. Then it changed its mind, built a team, hired the engineering talent, and went to win. The instrument of that win was the V-twin engine the company had first shown in 1907 and steadily improved. By 1911, a properly engineered version with mechanically operated valves, displacing around 11 cubic inches per cylinder, that finally delivered the power the single could not. 2 cylinders in a V, sharing 1 crankpin. It was fast, and it was loud, and on the board tracks it was very hard to beat. The factory that built these machines had grown beyond recognition. In 1913, the company tore down its old yellow brick building and put up a 5-story structure on Juneau Avenue that ran across 2 full blocks. The output numbers tell the story of the decade more honestly than any advertisement. In 1909, the company had built just over 1,100 motorcycles. In 1913, it built 16,284. By 1920, it built 28,189. And Harley-Davidson had passed Indian to become the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, with dealers established in 67 countries. In 1920, a rider named Otto Walker, on a Harley, became the first man to win a motorcycle race at an average speed of over 100 miles an hour. The company that had started with a machine that could not climb a hill now held the fastest sanctioned result in the sport. Then, at the height of its racing dominance, Harley-Davidson began to walk away from racing. The reasoning was the reasoning of a mature business rather than a fan. Racing was expensive. It killed riders and generated liability. And by the early 1920s, the company had already extracted what racing was for: the reputation, the imagination, the association of the bar and shield with victory. A young company races to build a name. A large company that has already built the name asks a colder question: what is this costing, and what is it still buying? The answer, increasingly, was that it cost a great deal and bought less than it once had. The Wrecking Crew had done its job. The job was never to win races. The job was to sell motorcycles, and it had. The machines themselves grew heavier and more powerful through the decade in ways that would define the brand for a century. In 1921, the company introduced a 74 cubic inch V-twin, a large displacement engine that established the big, torquey twin as the heart of the Harley-Davidson identity. In 1925, it adopted the rounded teardrop gas tank that became one of the most recognizable shapes in American manufacturing, a piece of styling so durable that its descendants sit on the machines today. In 1928, it finally added a front brake. These were not racing advances. They were the deliberate refinements of a company settling into what it actually was: a builder of large, comfortable, powerful road machines, with a distinctive look and a distinctive sound, sold to Americans who wanted presence rather than lap times. And as the company leaned into that identity, it leaned out of the expensive sport that had built its name. Through the early 1920s, Harley-Davidson steadily reduced its factory racing commitment, cutting a cost that no longer paid for itself. The reputation was banked. The company would spend the next several decades living off the interest. That decision to stop racing was also a decision about what kind of company Harley-Davidson would be in a shrinking market, and the shrinkage was real. Through the 1920s, the motorcycle in America was being pushed steadily out of the mainstream by the automobile, and the buyers who remained were increasingly institutional or specialized. Police departments became a major and reliable customer, drawn to the big Harleys for pursuit and patrol, and the company cultivated that business deliberately because a fleet order from a city police force was worth a great deal and did not depend on the whims of fashion. Rural mail carriers, delivery services, and enthusiasts filled out the rest. This was the quiet transformation of the 1920s. The motorcycle stopped being a thing most people might buy and became a thing specific people bought for specific reasons. Harley-Davidson survived that narrowing better than almost anyone because it had the reputation, the dealer network, and the scale to hold the customers who remained. The market was getting smaller. The company was determined to own a larger share of it. What racing left behind was more durable than any trophy. It left the V-twin as the heart of the company, the engine architecture that Harley-Davidson would build, in one form or another, for the next 100 years. And it left the sound. The 45-degree V-twin with both connecting rods sharing a single crankpin does not fire its cylinders at even intervals. One cylinder fires, then the other fires close behind it, and then the engine waits through a long gap before the sequence repeats. The result is a syncopated, uneven, rolling beat, the sound that would later be written down as potato, potato, potato. In the 1920s, it was simply the noise a Harley made. Nobody yet thought of it as property. It was a byproduct of the geometry, free to anyone who built an engine the same way. That fact, that the sound belonged to the physics and not to the company, would sit quietly for 70 years before it detonated in a courtroom. For now, the company had a proven machine, a national reputation, and a factory running at scale. What it did not have was a customer large enough to absorb everything it could build. That customer was about to arrive, wearing a uniform, and the relationship it began would save the company more than once and define it forever. Chapter 4. The Army's Favorite. In 1917, the United States entered the First World War, and the War Department needed machines that could move a man and a message faster than a horse and more flexibly than a truck. The motorcycle fit the gap exactly. It could carry a dispatch rider through terrain that stopped automobiles, scout ahead of a column, and haul a machine gun in a sidecar. And the American motorcycle industry, which had spent 15 years building fast, reliable, mass-produced V-twins, turned out to be sitting on exactly the product the Army wanted. Harley-Davidson and Indian both went to war. The decision facing Milwaukee was how far to commit, how much of a civilian business to convert into a military supplier for a war that might end at any time. Harley-Davidson committed hard. By the last year of the war, according to accounts from the period, a substantial share of the company's output, reported at roughly half, was going to the military, and over the course of American involvement, the company supplied something on the order of 15,000 to 20,000 machines to the armed forces. The exact figure varies by source and should be treated with caution, but the scale is not in doubt. The Army became, almost overnight, the largest single customer the company had ever had. Milwaukee also did something shrewder than simply filling orders. It opened a service school to train military mechanics on its machines, which meant that when the war ended, the Army was full of men who knew how to maintain a Harley and associated the name with the machine that had carried them through France. There is an anecdote from the end of the war that the company has never been shy about repeating, and that survives in enough retellings to be worth telling with appropriate care. According to widely circulated accounts, the first American to enter Germany after the armistice was a corporal named Roy Holtz, riding a Harley-Davidson. Whether or not that specific claim can be independently confirmed to the last detail, it captures something the company understood about what it had just become. The motorcycle was no longer only a civilian machine sold on reliability. It was now attached to the American soldier, to the war effort, to the image of the United States projecting force across an ocean. That association was worth more than any single contract, because a contract ends when the war ends, and an image does not. The war years also produced a revealing failure, and it is worth telling because it shows the company testing the limits of its own brand for the first time. In 1917, Harley-Davidson launched a line of bicycles, ordinary pedal bicycles, built for it in Dayton, Ohio, by the Davis Machine Company. The logic was a recruitment funnel. Get American boys onto a Harley-Davidson bicycle young, the thinking went, and they would graduate to a Harley-Davidson motorcycle as men. There was a diamond frame model for men, a step-through ladies standard, and a Boy Scout model aimed at children. It was a reasonable-sounding adjacency, and it did not work. The bicycles sold poorly, the brand did not transfer downward the way the company hoped, and in 1923, Harley-Davidson discontinued the line. The lesson was quiet but real, and it would echo across the company's whole history. The Harley-Davidson name was powerful, but it was not infinitely stretchable, and it did not automatically confer value on every product it was printed on. The name meant a specific thing, a serious motorcycle, and it lost its magic when applied to a child's bicycle. Decades later, under different owners, the company would forget that lesson at enormous cost. The Model T was teaching a harder version of it in the same years, undercutting the motorcycle's price until a used car cost less than a new bike and did more. The business logic of the government contract is a double-edged thing, and the founders learned both edges. On one side, the government is the customer that does not haggle over price, the way a farmer buying a single machine does, and that orders in volumes no civilian market can match. A war can fill a factory overnight. On the other side, that same customer vanishes the moment the war ends, leaving a manufacturer with expanded capacity, a swollen payroll, and a civilian market that has not grown to match. The boom is real, and the boom is temporary, and the company that forgets the second half of that sentence gets destroyed when the orders stop. Harley-Davidson had grown enormously on the strength of racing and reputation through the teens. The war accelerated it further. When the war ended in 1918, the acceleration ended with it. For a few years, that did not seem to matter, because the 1920s opened with Harley-Davidson as the largest motorcycle manufacturer on Earth. But the American motorcycle market itself was beginning to shrink, squeezed by a machine that was not a motorcycle at all. Henry Ford's Model T had fallen in price until a used one cost less than a new motorcycle, and it kept the rider dry, carried a family, and did not require the skill or the nerve a motorcycle demanded. Through the 20s, the motorcycle in America drifted from mainstream transportation towards something narrower. A machine for enthusiasts, for police departments, for people who wanted it rather than needed it. The industry that had once had hundreds of manufacturers began to thin, and Harley-Davidson, the largest of them, watched its market contract even as it stood at the top of it. Two American giants remained standing above the wreckage of the early industry, Harley-Davidson and Indian. Then, in the autumn of 1929, the floor of the entire American economy gave way, and the question stopped being which company would lead the motorcycle market. The question became whether there would be a motorcycle market at all. Chapter 5. The Two Survivors. The timing could not have been worse. Just months before the stock market collapsed in October of 1929, Harley-Davidson had introduced a new 45 cubic inch flathead V-twin, a machine built to compete with Indian's Scout and the Excelsior Super X. It was a sound product launched into a vanishing market. Indian riders mocked it. The upright generator on the early models made it look, to them, like it had a third cylinder, and they called it the three-cylinder Harley. The insult did not matter. What mattered was that the company had just spent its money bringing a new motorcycle to market at the precise moment that Americans stopped being able to buy motorcycles at all. The numbers of the collapse are stark enough to state plainly. In 1929, Harley-Davidson sold around 21,000 motorcycles. In 1933, at the bottom of the Great Depression, it sold 3,703. That is a decline of better than 80% in 4 years. A company that sells 4/5 less product than it did before, while carrying the same factory and much of the same overhead, does not survive by ordinary means. It survives by doing whatever it can find to do. And that is exactly what Milwaukee did. The survival strategy had two parts, and both were unglamorous. The first was to cut everything that could be cut and hold on. The second was to find revenue anywhere it could be found, even revenue that had nothing to do with selling motorcycles to individual riders. Harley-Davidson began building industrial power plants based on its motorcycle engines, stationary motors that could run equipment. And in 1932, it introduced the Servi car, a three-wheeled delivery vehicle built on motorcycle mechanicals, aimed at businesses rather than enthusiasts. Police departments could use it. Garages could use it to ferry cars. It was not romantic. It was a tricycle with a cargo box, and it was designed to sell to institutions with money to spend when individuals had none. It worked well enough that the Servi car stayed in production for more than 40 years, until 1973. In the worst years, the ugly, practical machine helped keep the beautiful, romantic company alive. There is an episode from these Depression years that reads, in hindsight, like the setup to a joke the company would not get for another 40 years. In the mid-1930s, searching for revenue anywhere it could find it, Harley-Davidson licensed its designs and manufacturing knowledge to a company in Japan. An American businessman named Alfred Richchild helped establish a production line there, building the 74 cubic inch Harley-Davidson VL under license for the Japanese market. When the Japanese licensee later severed its formal relationship with Milwaukee around 1936, it kept right on building the machines under a new name, Rikuo, which continued producing Harley-based motorcycles in Japan for years. Sit with that. In the depths of the Depression, to raise cash, Harley-Davidson taught a Japanese company how to build its motorcycles. 2 decades later, the Japanese motorcycle industry would come across the Pacific and nearly destroy it. The company that would one day beg Washington for protection from Japanese machines had, in its desperation, helped seed motorcycle manufacturing in Japan in the first place. It is not a straight line from Rikuo to Honda, and the claim should not be overstated, but the irony is exact enough to keep. The survival move of one decade helped arm the competitor of the next. Meanwhile, the company kept building at home, adding an 80 cubic inch flathead in 1935, and generating publicity where it could, as when a Georgia woman named Vivian Bales rode a Harley thousands of miles across the country and became a minor national story. Consider what the American motorcycle industry looked like when the dust settled. At its peak in the early years of the century, the United States had been home to a large number of motorcycle manufacturers. By many counts, well over 100 distinct makers had come and gone. The Depression finished what the Model T had started. When it was over, 2 American motorcycle companies remained, Harley-Davidson and Indian. Everyone else was gone, bankrupt, absorbed, or quietly shut. The 2 survivors did not survive because their machines were transcendently better than every competitor that failed. They survived because they were the largest, the best capitalized, and the most ruthless about cutting to fit a market that had collapsed underneath them. Survival, in this business, was not a reward for excellence. It was a strategy, executed under pressure, and it had a bitter taste. Even at the bottom, the company kept engineering, because it understood that the Depression would eventually end, and the market that emerged would want something new. In 1936, in the depths of the recovery, Harley-Davidson introduced the model that would point toward its future, the 61 cubic inch overhead valve machine that the world would come to call the Knucklehead for the shape of its rocker covers. It was a genuine advance, a more powerful and more modern engine, and it arrived with the valvetrain problems that new designs bring, requiring a mid-year redesign and retrofits on the earliest units. But it established the overhead valve Big Twin as the direction of travel. The company that had spent the early 30s building delivery tricycles to make payroll was, at the same time, building the engine architecture that would carry it into the post-war boom. The Depression taught Harley-Davidson a lesson it would relearn painfully several more times across its history: that being one of the last companies standing is not the same as being safe. Indian had survived too, and the rivalry between the two would define American motorcycling for another 2 decades, until one of them died and left the other truly alone. But that reckoning was still years away. What arrived first was the event that would take the machine Harley-Davidson had spent 40 years perfecting and turn it, permanently, into a symbol. In 1939, the world went to war again. And this time, the machine Milwaukee sent overseas would come home with a aim that had nothing to do with reliability or speed. It would come home called the Liberator. Chapter 6. The Liberator. The Army came to Harley-Davidson with a specification, and Harley-Davidson answered it with a machine that would be built in numbers the company had never approached. The motorcycle was the Wheeler, W for the engine series, L for the compression, A for Army. It was based on the 45 cubic inch flathead V-twin the company had been building since the eve of the Depression, now stripped, ruggedized, and fitted for war. Blackout lighting, a heavy luggage rack, a scabbard for a submachine gun, air cleaners built to breathe through dust and sand. It produced around 25 horsepower. It was not fast, and it was not elegant. It was designed to start, to run, and to keep running in conditions that destroyed more sophisticated machines. It was, in other words, the silent gray fellow's promise rebuilt for a battlefield. The production numbers dwarfed anything in the company's history. Across the war, Harley-Davidson built approximately 56,000 walls, plus roughly 20,000 of a Canadian variant called the WLSE, something on the order of 75,000 military machines in total, and by some broader counts approaching 90,000 when all military production and spares are included. There is a peculiar detail in the record that shows how completely the war absorbed the company. Nearly all of the walls built after the attack on Pearl Harbor carried serial numbers designating them as 1942 models, regardless of the year they were actually assembled. The machines are known to collectors, decades later, as 42 laws, whether they rolled off the line in 1942 or 1944. The company had stopped counting model years. It was simply building war material as fast as it could. And it was not only building for the American Army. Under the Lend-Lease program, the United States shipped enormous quantities of war material to its allies, and Harley-Davidson motorcycles went with it. The Soviet Union received the largest share, approximately 30,000 walls, machines built in Milwaukee that ended up in the hands of the Red Army on the Eastern Front. There is a quiet irony worth naming plainly. Harley-Davidson, the machine that would become the most American object imaginable, the rolling symbol of the United States, spent the war years shipping 30,000 units to Joseph Stalin. The Soviets, unlike the Americans, frequently fitted their walls with sidecars and used them as frontline combat vehicles. The most American motorcycle ever built went to war for the Soviet Union in numbers, and did so because the business of a manufacturer in wartime is to fill the order in front of it. The company was recognized for how well it filled those orders. Harley-Davidson received the Army-Navy E Award for excellence in wartime production, an honor given for meeting the punishing demands of military manufacturing, and it received it more than once, in 1943 and again in 1945. There was also a road not taken. At the Army's request, Harley-Davidson developed a very different machine, the XA, a shaft-driven flat twin whose engine was, by most accounts, a close copy of the German BMW design the Army had encountered in North Africa. The flat twin ran cooler than the V-twin in desert conditions, but only around 1,000 were built, because the Army had found something better for general-purpose work than any motorcycle, the Jeep. The four-wheeled Jeep could do most of what a motorcycle did and carry more men while doing it, and the military's enthusiasm for the two-wheeled Scout faded as the Jeep proliferated. The XA died as a curiosity. The VLA soldiered on. The economics of the wartime machine were the inverse of everything the company had known. A Voila sold to the Army for a low, fixed price, reportedly somewhere around $380 per motorcycle, with no dealer, no marketing, and no haggling, just a specification to meet and a volume to hit. The margin per machine was thin. The volume was everything. This was the government contract logic the company had first tasted in the First World War, now operating at a scale several times larger, and it kept the factory running flat out through years when the civilian market had effectively ceased to exist. When the Second World War ended, the relationship did not fully end with it. The Korean War brought the Willah back into production between roughly 1949 and 1952, a reminder that once a company becomes a military supplier, the military remains a customer it returns to across decades. But the deeper significance of the war was not in the contracts or the margins. It was that the company had spent nearly a decade, depression, then war, building either delivery tricycles or military flatheads, and had emerged with its civilian engineering frozen in place while a symbol of enormous power accumulated around its name. The knucklehead overhead valve engine it had introduced in 1936 pointed toward a modern future. The war had put that future on hold. The myth, meanwhile, had grown without limit. But the number that mattered most from the Second World War was not a production figure or a dollar amount. It was a name. Somewhere in the fighting across occupied Europe, soldiers began calling the Harley-Davidson the Liberator, because it was the machine they were seen riding as they moved through towns the Germans had just left. The name was earned in the most literal way. The Harley was, physically, one of the machines on which liberation arrived. And in that name, the entire future strategy of the company was born, though no one in Milwaukee could have written it down at the time. The motorcycle had become something larger than transportation. It had become a symbol of American arrival, American freedom, American force. The sound of that engine, rolling into a liberated square, was becoming the sound of the country that built it. That was the asset. Not the flathead engine, which was already outdated. Not the factory, which would have to be reconverted to civilian production at a loss. The asset was the meaning the machine had picked up in the war, the association, burned into a generation of young American men who had ridden or seen these motorcycles, between the Harley-Davidson and everything they wanted to feel about coming home. When the war ended, hundreds of thousands of those men came back to the United States, and a great many of them wanted, more than almost anything, to ride. The company had spent the war building machines. It had come out of the war owning a myth. What it did with that myth over the next 20 years, and what a subculture it never planned for did with it, would matter more to the business than any engineering decision Milwaukee ever made. Chapter 7. The Outlaw. On the 4th of July weekend in 1947, several thousand motorcyclists rode into the small town of Hollister, California, for a racing event and a rally, and for a few days the town was overwhelmed. Too many riders, too much drinking, some public disorder, and a local police force too small to manage the crowd. By the standards of what actually happened, it was a rowdy holiday weekend that got out of hand. By the standards of what it became, it was the founding myth of the American biker. A photograph ran in Life magazine of a heavy-set man slouched on a motorcycle, surrounded by beer bottles, and the image traveled across the country as evidence of a new and dangerous American type, the motorcycle outlaw. How staged or exaggerated that photograph was has been argued ever since, and the truth is genuinely contested. What is not contested is the effect. The image stuck. 6 years later, Hollywood made the myth permanent. In 1953, the film The Wild One put Marlon Brando on screen as the leader of a motorcycle gang rolling into a small town, and it fixed the leather-jacketed biker into American culture as an icon of menace and freedom at once. Here, the story folds in on itself in a way the company could not have scripted and did not control. Brando's character, the definitive American motorcycle rebel, did not ride a Harley-Davidson in the film. He rode a Triumph, a British machine. The single most influential piece of motorcycle imagery of the post-war era was, technically, an advertisement for a competitor, and it did not matter at all. The image the film burned into the public mind was the image of the American outlaw biker, and in the United States, the outlaw biker rode a Harley. The association was too strong for a movie prop to dislodge. Out of the Hollister weekend came a piece of folklore that shows how completely the outlaw meaning had escaped the company's control, and it deserves telling with care because it is genuinely contested. According to the story that circulated for decades, the American Motorcycle Association responded to the bad press by declaring that 99% of motorcyclists were law-abiding citizens, which meant, the outlaw clubs decided, that they were the other 1%. They embraced the label, and the 1%er became a badge of honor, sometimes worn as a patch. The association has said it has no record of ever issuing such a statement, so whether the quote was ever really made cannot be confirmed, and the tale may be as invented as the Hollister riot itself. But the fact that the legend took hold at all is the point. An entire subculture built an identity around being the dangerous exception, and it did so on machines that were, overwhelmingly, Harley-Davidsons. The film that sealed the image, The Wild One, was considered so provocative that it was effectively banned from British cinemas for more than a decade. The company that made the motorcycles said almost nothing, because there was almost nothing it could say. Its product had become the flag of a rebellion it had not started and could not lead, and the rebellion was selling motorcycles better than any advertisement Milwaukee could have written. This is the strangest and most important fact in the entire business history of Harley-Davidson, and it deserves to be stated without decoration. The company did not create the outlaw image. It did not want the outlaw image. For years, it was actively embarrassed by the image, because the men who ran Milwaukee were conservative Midwestern manufacturers who wanted their machines associated with police departments and respectable enthusiasts, not with gangs. The outlaw meaning was created by a subculture, amplified by a magazine photo, and cemented by a film that featured a British motorcycle, and it became the single most valuable asset the company owned. The moat around Harley-Davidson was not its engineering. It was a meaning the company never authored and, for a long time, wished it could disown. The meaning had a sound, and the sound was becoming inseparable from it. The uneven, loping beat of the 45-degree V-twin, the potato that came from two cylinders sharing one crankpin, was now attached in the public ear to everything the outlaw image carried. Menace, freedom, the open road, the refusal to be ordinary. A machine that sounded like a sewing machine could not carry that meaning. A machine that sounded like distant artillery could. The sound had started as a byproduct of geometry, a quirk the founders never designed for. It was becoming, in the post-war decades, the audible signature of an entire American identity. The company had not built that either. It had simply built the engine, and the engine's imperfect rhythm had become, without anyone's permission, a piece of the national soundtrack. But an asset made of meaning has a dangerous property. It can float free of the physical product entirely. And that is precisely what began to happen to Harley-Davidson in the 1950s and 60s. The myth grew and grew. The outlaw image, the wartime liberator, the sound, the association with a certain vision of American freedom. Meanwhile, the machines themselves stopped keeping pace. The engineering that had once won endurance runs and board track races settled into a slow, heavy, increasingly dated design. The company was selling a feeling, and the feeling was strong enough to paper over the fact that the motorcycle underneath it was falling behind. For a while, in a market with no serious competition, that gap between the myth and the machine did not cost anything. Then the competition arrived, from a direction Milwaukee had not been watching, and the gap became a wound. The first blow came not from a rival's motorcycle, but from a rival's advertising slogan, and it was aimed with precision at everything the outlaw image had built. Chapter 8. The Sound and the Arithmetic. In 1953, Indian went out of business. The rivalry that had defined American motorcycling for half a century, Harley against Indian, Milwaukee against Springfield, ended not with Harley-Davidson's triumph, but with Indian's collapse, and it left Harley-Davidson in a position that sounded like victory and turned out to be exposure. Harley-Davidson was now the only American motorcycle manufacturer of any size. There was no domestic competitor left to measure against, no rival to keep the company sharp. It stood alone in the American market. And a company that stands alone in a market has a way of mistaking the absence of competitors for the absence of threats. The threat was simply coming from somewhere Milwaukee was not looking, across the Pacific. There had been an early warning, and the company's response to it revealed exactly how it thought. In 1952, before Indian had even finished dying, Harley-Davidson petitioned the United States Tariff Commission for a 40% tax on imported motorcycles and asked for restrictions on the imports coming into the country. The petition was rejected. Worse than rejected, the company was charged with restrictive business practices in connection with how it handled its dealers and the market. The lesson of that episode is worth marking and holding, because it will return. In 1952, faced with the first stirrings of foreign competition, Harley-Davidson's instinct was to ask the government for protection, to solve a competitive problem with a tariff wall rather than a better product. The government said no. Remember that, the company asked. 30 years later, the same request would be answered very differently, and the reversal would say something important about how the company had changed. Then, in 1959, Honda came to America. The Japanese company that had built itself out of the rubble of post-war Japan opened American operations, and its strategy was the exact opposite of everything the outlaw image stood for. Honda sold small, light, clean, reliable, inexpensive motorcycles, and it marketed them with a slogan engineered to erase the menace that Hollister and Brando had built. You meet the nicest people on a Honda. It was aimed at people who would never have walked into a Harley dealership. Young people, office workers, women, families. It grew the motorcycle market by pulling in millions of riders who wanted nothing to do with the outlaw and everything to do with cheap, easy transportation. And once Honda had those riders, the rest of the Japanese industry followed. Kawasaki, Suzuki, and Yamaha completed what the industry would call the Big Four, and together they produced a category of machine the market came to call the universal Japanese motorcycle. Competent, affordable, reliable, and improving every single year. Harley-Davidson's attempts to meet the small bike threat on its own terms only proved how trapped it was by its own meaning. After the war, it had acquired, as reparations, the design of a small German two-stroke motorcycle, the DK Way, and it built versions of it, including a lightweight model nicknamed the Hummer, through the 1950s and into the 60s. In 1960, it bought half of the Italian manufacturer Ermacchi and began importing small Italian machines badged as Harley-Davidsons, the Sprint among them, and it even tried a scooter, the Topper. None of it worked the way the company needed. The problem was not that these were bad machines. The problem was that a small, light, economical motorcycle wearing a Harley-Davidson badge was a contradiction in terms. The entire value of the name came from the big, heavy, loud American cruiser and everything it meant. And that meaning actively repelled the buyer who wanted cheap, sensible transportation. Harley-Davidson could not become Honda, because the thing that made it Harley-Davidson was the opposite of what made Honda successful. And here, the oldest irony in the story closed a little further. Because the country now flooding the American market with the machines Milwaukee could not compete against was the same country to which Harley-Davidson, 3 decades earlier, had licensed its own designs to survive the Depression. The arithmetic that Harley-Davidson now faced was brutal and simple. The Japanese machines were cheaper to buy. They were faster. They handled better. They leaked no oil, started every time, and needed a fraction of the maintenance. On every measurable dimension of the product, price, performance, reliability, quality, the imports were winning, and the gap was widening year over year. Harley-Davidson had one thing the Japanese did not, and could not easily manufacture. It had the myth. It had the liberator, the outlaw, the sound, the 70 years of American meaning welded to the bar and shield. The strategic question the company faced was the hardest question in business. What does a company do when its product is genuinely worse than a competitor's, but its brand means something the competitor's does not? There is no out-engineering a rival who is winning on engineering. The only remaining move is to compete on meaning, to sell the thing the competitor cannot copy, the identity rather than the machine. But meaning does not fix an oil leak, and meaning does not lower a price. And through the 1960s, the pressure on Harley-Davidson mounted past what the family company could carry alone. The machines were aging. The Japanese were taking the market. The capital required to modernize, to design new engines, retool factories, compete on the actual product, was beyond what the company generated. The founders were gone or aging, the second generation was in charge, and the business needed money and scale it did not have. So the men who ran Harley-Davidson did the thing that companies in that position do. In 1965, they took the company public to raise capital, and when that proved insufficient to fight the war they were losing, they looked for a larger partner to buy them, protect them, and fund the fight. In 1969, they found one. The buyer had the capital. The buyer had the scale. The buyer was a sprawling American conglomerate whose businesses included bowling equipment, tennis rackets, and industrial machinery, and whose interest in motorcycles was strictly financial. Its name was American Machine and Foundry, and the decade that followed would take the most valuable myth in American manufacturing and very nearly grind it into a punchline. Chapter 9. Bowling Balls and Bad Bikes. American Machine and Foundry bought Harley-Davidson in 1969, and the price, by most accounts, was in the neighborhood of $21 million. AMF was a conglomerate of the kind that flourished in the 1960s, a company that collected businesses the way some men collect stamps, bowling equipment, sporting goods, industrial products, and now motorcycles. The logic of the acquisition was pure conglomerate logic. Harley-Davidson was a recognized American brand with a loyal customer base and, in AMF's view, an underexploited capacity to produce more units and generate more revenue. The plan was straightforward: increase production, grow the volume, harvest the brand. What that plan failed to account for was that the thing making Harley-Davidson valuable could not survive the process of being scaled that way. Production went up fast. AMF pushed the output of the Milwaukee and York facilities hard, aiming to capitalize on demand and grow the numbers the way a conglomerate grows numbers. But the manufacturing base was old, the tooling was tired, and the workforce was pushed into higher volumes without the investment in quality that higher volumes require. The result was a collapse in quality that became legendary, and not in a good way. By the accounts that survive from the period, a staggering share of the motorcycles coming off the line, more than half, by some internal measures, failed final inspection and needed rework before they could be sold. Bikes leaked oil so reliably that owners kept drip pans under them as a matter of course. Parts failed. Fit and finish deteriorated. The machines that reached customers were, too often, defective. The market responded the way markets respond, and it did so with cruelty. The nickname Hog, which had once been an affectionate term for a big Harley, curdled into an insult. Riders and critics rechristened the company with a set of mocking names that spread through the motorcycle world and stuck: Harley-Abelson, Hardly Drivable, Hoagley-Ferguson. These were not the jokes of enemies. They were the jokes of a public that had loved the brand and felt betrayed by the product. And that is the most dangerous kind of joke a company can inspire, because it comes from the people who wanted to keep believing. Every one of those nicknames was a small withdrawal from the account of goodwill that 7 decades had built. And AMF was spending that account down faster than any factory could refill it. The physical scale of the AMF expansion made the quality problem worse rather than better. The conglomerate moved much of the motorcycle assembly to a large plant in York, Pennsylvania, separating final assembly from the engine and transmission work that remained in Wisconsin, and ramped the combined output toward volumes the old tooling and the old processes were never built to sustain. More machines flowed through a system that could not reliably build the machines it was already making. The defects that resulted were not exotic. They were the basic failures of a manufacturing operation running beyond its capability: parts that did not fit, finishes that did not hold, engines that leaked and rattled and, often enough, did not run right off the truck. Dealers, the people Arthur Davidson had spent his life recruiting to stand behind the product, were now on the front line of customer anger, forced to make good on machines that should never have left the factory. Every warranty repair was a cost the company absorbed, and a customer relationship it strained. The conglomerate had treated Harley-Davidson as a volume opportunity, a strong brand that could simply be told to produce more. What it discovered, and what it never fully solved, was that producing more of a machine a company cannot build well does not multiply the value of the brand. It divides it. Volume without quality is not growth. It is the fastest known way to spend down a reputation that took 70 years to build. Each additional defective motorcycle did not add revenue so much as it subtracted trust, and trust was the only thing the brand had ever really been selling. Labor made it worse. In 1974, the workforce went on strike, and the relationship between the conglomerate's management and the men who actually built the motorcycles deteriorated into the kind of mutual contempt that shows up in the product. When the people building the machine do not trust the people running the company, the quality suffers in ways no inspection regime can fully catch. Meanwhile, the Japanese were not standing still. Every year that Harley-Davidson spent shipping defective machines under increasingly hostile management, the Big Four shipped better, cheaper, more reliable motorcycles and took more of the market. The gap between the myth and the machine, which had been a manageable weakness in the 1950s, became a chasm under AMF. The brand still meant something. The product increasingly did not deserve it. Here is the precise business failure of the AMF years, stated as cleanly as it can be. A brand is a promise. Harley-Davidson's promise, built over 70 years, was that the machine wearing the bar and shield embodied a certain kind of American authenticity, durability, and meaning. AMF stretched the brand to cover a product that no longer kept the promise. It put the name on machines that leaked, failed, and disappointed, and it did so at the exact moment that superior competitors were offering the market a better alternative. A brand stretched past the authority of the product underneath it does not just fail to add value. It converts its own loyal customers into its loudest critics. The AMF era did not destroy the meaning of Harley-Davidson. The meaning proved more durable than the mismanagement. But it came closer to destroying it than any war or depression ever had, and it did so from the inside. Not everyone at the company accepted the decline. Inside Harley-Davidson, a group of executives, engineers, and managers who had lived through the fall and understood both what the brand was worth and what was being done to it, watched the conglomerate turn their company into a national joke and reached a conclusion that was equal parts loyalty and cold calculation. They believed, did not want the motorcycle business anymore and did not understand it. The brand, they believed, was still worth more than the market thought, because the market was pricing the defective product and not the underlying meaning. And meaning, unlike tooling, could not be bought cheaply by anyone once it was gone. In 1981, 13 of those executives decided to do something that looked, from the outside, close to insane. They decided to buy the company back. Chapter 10. The Eagle Soars Alone. In June of 1981, 13 Harley-Davidson executives, led by Vaughn Beals and including Willie G. Davidson, a grandson of one of the founders, and the man who had kept the design language of the motorcycles alive through the worst of the AMF years, completed a leveraged buyout of Harley-Davidson from American Machine and Foundry. The price was $81.5 million. The structure of the deal is the part that matters, and it is the part that should make a careful listener wince. The 13 executives did not have $81.5 million. Among them, they put up roughly $1 million of their own equity. The rest, more than $80 million, was borrowed, in a financing led by Citibank and a consortium of lenders. The men who bought Harley-Davidson bought it almost entirely with debt, secured against the company itself. Think about what that meant. A leveraged buyout of that shape is a bet placed with someone else's money, where the borrower's own stake is small and the lender's exposure is enormous, and where the debt must be serviced out of the cash the business generates, a business that was, at that moment, losing market share to the Japanese and carrying the reputation AMF had built for it. If Harley-Davidson recovered, the 13 executives would own an American icon they had rescued. If it did not, the debt would crush it, and them. There was very little middle ground in a deal financed that thin. The executives took the bet anyway, because they believed the one thing the balance sheet did not show, that the brand was worth more than the numbers said, and that they, unlike AMF, knew how to make the product live up to it. The company marked the moment with a gesture that showed exactly what it thought it had reclaimed. The buyback was celebrated under a slogan, "The Eagle Soars Alone," and a group of the new owners and employees rode motorcycles from the York, Pennsylvania plant back toward Milwaukee, a rolling declaration that Harley-Davidson was, once again, an independent American company owned by people who cared about motorcycles rather than by a conglomerate that cared about a line item. The eagle was the company's own symbol, and soaring alone meant free of AMF, free of the conglomerate, standing on its own for the first time in 12 years. It was a genuinely stirring piece of theater, and it was backed by more than $80 million of debt that would come due whether or not anyone felt stirred. It is worth being precise about who took this bet, because the composition of the group explains why it worked when the conglomerate had failed. These were not outside financiers looking for an asset to flip. They were operators, men who had run the company's engineering and manufacturing from inside, who knew exactly how bad the quality was because they had signed off on it, and who believed they knew how to fix it. Vaughn Beals had come to Harley-Davidson from AMF itself to oversee engineering, and had watched the decline up close. Richard Tierlink, who would later run the company, brought the financial discipline. Willie G. Davidson carried the design and the family name. AMF, for its part, was a willing seller. The conglomerate had concluded that the motorcycle business was more trouble than it was worth and was content to let it go. So the transaction had a strange symmetry. A seller relieved to be rid of a business it had degraded, and a group of buyers convinced that the business the seller was degrading was worth staking their careers and their houses to reclaim. One side was pricing the broken product. The other side was pricing the unbroken meaning. History would prove the buyers right about the meaning, but it would first spend 4 years trying to prove them wrong about their ability to survive long enough to matter. The men who now owned the company understood their real problem better than AMF ever had, and they stated it internally in terms that had nothing to do with the myth. The myth was fine. The myth had survived the war, the depression, and the outlaw image, and it would survive The problem was the machine, and behind the machine, the factory. Harley-Davidson's manufacturing was a disaster. The quality failures, the rework rates, the inventory piled up on the floor, the fundamental inability to build a motorcycle right the first time. The Japanese were not beating Harley-Davidson because they had a better brand. They were beating it because they had a radically better manufacturing system. And the new owners, led on the operations side by figures including Vaughn Beals and later Richard Tierlink, made a decision that separated them from every romantic notion of what the company was. They decided that the way to save an American myth was to copy the Japanese factory. That decision was correct, and it very nearly did not get the chance to work. Because between the triumphant buyback of 1981 and the recovery it was supposed to produce, the American economy fell into a deep recession, motorcycle sales collapsed further, and the company, loaded with $80 million of debt, began to hemorrhage money. The Eagle had soared alone, straight into the worst possible moment to be carrying that much debt. Within a year of the buyout, Harley-Davidson was losing money at a rate that put the entire bet in jeopardy, and the lenders who had financed the dream began to look at their exposure and reconsider. The company had spent everything to buy back its own name. Now it had to survive long enough to prove the name was worth what it had paid. It came within days of failing. Chapter 11. 4 days. The year 1982 nearly ended the story. The recession drove motorcycle sales down hard, and Harley-Davidson posted an operating loss of around $25 million. The company that had just borrowed its way to independence was now bleeding cash against that debt, and management responded with cuts that showed how serious it was. The workforce was reduced by about 40%, down to roughly 2,200 employees. The break-even point, the number of motorcycles the company had to sell just to cover its costs, was driven down from around 53,000 units in 1980 toward 35,000, because at the volumes the market would now bear, 53,000 was a fantasy. In that single year, the company sold about 27,000 motorcycles. It was building fewer machines than its old break-even required, servicing enormous debt, and watching the imports take more of the market every quarter. This was not a turnaround yet. This was survival triage. The new owners pursued 2 remedies at once, one in Washington and one on the factory floor. In Washington, the company that had been rejected in 1952 tried again, and this time the political weather had changed. In 1983, the Reagan administration granted Harley-Davidson tariff protection, imposing a steep additional tariff on imported heavyweight motorcycles, the machines over 700 cubic centimeters that competed directly with Harley's big twins. The headline figure was a 45% tariff in the first year, scheduled to decline over 5 years. The purpose was explicit and limited. It was not meant to save Harley-Davidson. It was meant to buy Harley-Davidson time, a few years of breathing room, behind a wall, to fix the things that a tariff could never fix. The tariff could hold the Japanese back for a season. It could not build a better motorcycle. Only the company could do that, and only if it survived long enough to try. Survival came down to a matter of days, and the story of how close it ran is the least romantic and most important chapter in the company's history. The financing from the 1981 buyout had left Harley-Davidson dependent on its lenders' continued willingness to advance credit. By late 1984, the lead lender, Citibank, had concluded that the motorcycle business was too risky and decided it wanted out. A lender deciding to exit a company that is losing money and drowning in debt is, ordinarily, a death sentence, because there is rarely anyone waiting to take its place. Harley-Davidson negotiated hard, and Citibank agreed to write off a portion of the debt, around $10 million, as the price of its exit. But that still left the company needing a new lender willing to finance a business that its previous lender had just fled. Without one, the only remaining path was bankruptcy. Management prepared for it. By the accounts that survive, the company came within days of filing for Chapter 11. Then, at the very end of 1985, a replacement lender stepped in. Heller Financial agreed to refinance the loan that Citibank was abandoning, and the deal closed on the last day of the year, December 31st, 1985. That refinancing, arranged in the final days before the company would have run out of options, is the reason Harley-Davidson exists. Not the tariff, not the myth. A last-minute financing agreement, signed on New Year's Eve, that kept a nearly bankrupt manufacturer alive for 1 more year. The men who ran the company had spent 1985 preparing to lose it, and a lender's signature at the close of the year gave them the one thing they could not manufacture: time. The Eagle had come within 4 days of falling out of the sky. It was caught, barely, by a loan. While the financial drama played out, the real work, the work that would actually save the company if anything could, was happening in the factories, and it was a wholesale importation of Japanese manufacturing method into an American plant. Harley-Davidson studied how Honda and the others built motorcycles and adopted the practices: just-in-time inventory, where parts arrive as they are needed rather than piling up on the floor, statistical quality control, and, crucially, the involvement of the workers themselves in finding and fixing defects rather than treating them as interchangeable hands. The results were measurable and dramatic. Before the transformation, more than half of the motorcycles coming off the line failed inspection, against a Japanese failure rate around 5%. After it, roughly 99% of machines came off the assembly line ready to ride. Inventory was cut by around 75%. Inventory turnover, a core measure of manufacturing efficiency, rose from about 4 times a year to 20 times a year by the end of the decade. The company had not changed its myth. It had changed its factory, and the factory was where it had been dying. The factory fixes needed a machine worthy of them, and in 1984, the company delivered it. That year, Harley-Davidson introduced a new engine, developed through the worst of the crisis on a budget the company could barely afford, called the Evolution, the Evo, as riders came to know it. It was an all-aluminum V-twin that finally solved the problems that had haunted the brand for a generation. It did not leak oil the way its predecessors had. It ran cooler, held together, started reliably, and needed far less fussing. For the first time in decades, a customer could buy a new Harley-Davidson and reasonably expect it to behave like a modern motorcycle rather than a temperamental antique. The Evolution engine did for the product what the just-in-time system did for the factory. It closed the gap between what the machine was and what the myth promised. In the same period, the company introduced the Softail, built around a rear suspension design it had acquired from an independent Missouri engineer named Bill Davis, which hid the shock absorbers to give the machine the clean lines of an old, rigid-frame motorcycle while actually cushioning the ride. Modern reliability, wrapped in vintage style, sold on the strength of a myth. That combination was the entire recovery formula, and by the mid-1980s, it finally existed in a single motorcycle a customer could buy. By 1986, the recovery had enough momentum for the final move. Harley-Davidson returned to the public markets, raising around $90 million through a stock and debt offering, roughly $20 million in common stock and $70 million in subordinated notes, money that let it pay down the crushing buyout debt and finance its future on healthier terms. And then the company did something that revealed, more than any slogan, how completely it had changed its mind about how to win. In 1987, with the tariff protection still in place and scheduled to run another year, Harley-Davidson petitioned the government to end the tariff early. Recall the company that in 1952 had begged for a tariff wall and been refused. Here was its successor, 35 years later, voluntarily giving up the protection it had finally been granted, declaring publicly that it no longer needed it, that it could now beat the Japanese on the product itself. It was a masterstroke of positioning, and it was also, apparently, true. The company had fixed the machine. Now it would go and reclaim the one asset that had never stopped being valuable, and it would try to do so in a way no manufacturer had ever attempted, by owning the sound. Chapter 12. Trademarking a noise. The recovery, once it took hold, was total. By 1989, Harley-Davidson had clawed back to around 59% of the American heavyweight motorcycle market, a dominant position in the very category the Japanese had nearly taken from it entirely, with Honda, the second-place finisher, holding around 15%. The company that had been 4 days from bankruptcy in 1985 was, by the end of the decade, the leader of its market again. And it had done it, remarkably, without ever abandoning the strategy that the AIMF years had nearly discredited, the strategy of selling meaning. What had changed was that now the meaning was backed by a machine that finally worked, and the combination proved almost unstoppable. A working motorcycle plus an unmatched myth was a product the Japanese could not answer, because they could build the motorcycle, but they could not build the 70 years of American meaning welded to the bar and shield. The company learned to monetize the meaning with a sophistication it had never shown before, and the clearest instrument of that was an organization founded in 1983, in the depths of the crisis, called the Harley Owners Group. Its acronym was the very word that had been an insult a decade earlier under AMF, HOG. The company took the slur that had mocked its failure and turned it into the name of its loyalty program, a club that bound hundreds of thousands of riders to the brand through rallies, events, and a shared identity. It was a deliberate reclamation. The word that had meant Harley-Davidson now meant belonging. Years later, in 2006, the company would go so far as to change its ticker symbol on the New York Stock Exchange to the letters HOG. The insult had become the brand, and then the insult had become the stock. There are few cleaner examples in business of a company capturing the language its enemies had used against it and reselling it as pride. The product line leaned all the way into the myth. In 1990, Harley-Davidson introduced the Fat Boy, a heavy, styled cruiser that became one of the most recognizable motorcycles ever built, and the customer base for these machines told the real story of what the company had become. This was no longer transportation for the working rider or the outlaw. The median household income of a Harley-Davidson rider, which had been around $38,000 in 1987, had roughly doubled to around $83,000 by 1997. The typical buyer was now a prosperous, middle-aged professional purchasing a motorcycle not because he needed to get somewhere, but because of what the machine meant and what riding it let him feel. The company had completed the transformation that the liberator and the outlaw had begun. It was, definitively, in the business of selling identity, and its customers were affluent people buying their way into a myth. The company's dependence on the sound became clearest in the one moment it tried to move beyond it. In 2001, Harley-Davidson introduced the V-Rod, built around an all-new engine it called the Revolution, a liquid-cooled, dual-overhead cam V-twin producing around 115 horsepower, developed with engineering help from Porsche. By any objective measure, it was the most advanced motorcycle the company had ever built, a genuine attempt to compete on performance with the machines the Japanese and Europeans were making. And a significant part of the traditional customer base rejected it, precisely because it was liquid-cooled and high-revving, and did not look or sound like a proper Harley-Davidson. To modernize the machine, the company had to move away from the air-cooled, single crankpin architecture that produced the sound, and moving away from the sound meant moving away from the thing customers were actually buying. The lesson was expensive and clarifying. Around the same time, the company was riding a wave of loyalty so strong that its 2300th anniversary celebration drew enormous crowds to Milwaukee, and its partnership with the sport bike builder Buell was exploring yet another attempt to reach performance riders. But the V-Rod had already revealed the trap at the center of the business. The asset and the constraint were the same object. The sound sold the motorcycle, and the sound also imprisoned it. And so, in February of 1994, Harley-Davidson made the move that this entire story has been building toward. It filed an application with the United States Patent and Trademark Office to register, as a trademark, the sound of its motorcycles. The application sought to protect the exhaust sound produced by the company's V-twin engines, the potato, potato, potato that came from two pistons sharing a single crankpin and firing at uneven intervals. Read that plainly, because it is genuinely extraordinary. A company was attempting to take legal ownership of a noise. Not a jingle it had composed, not a recorded sound it had created, but the incidental acoustic byproduct of an engine's mechanical geometry, the sound the physics made for free. The company had spent 90 years turning that sound into the audible signature of America, and now it wanted to own it the way it owned the bar and shield. The competitors came for the application immediately, and there were many of them. 9 rival manufacturers, a group that included Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki, Yamaha, and others, filed opposition, and their argument was devastating in its simplicity. The sound, they pointed out, was not unique to Harley-Davidson. It was the natural result of a particular engine configuration, the 45-degree V-twin with a shared crankpin, and any manufacturer who built an engine that way would produce the same sound, because the sound came from the geometry, not from the brand. Harley-Davidson had not invented the arrangement and could not claim exclusive rights to its acoustic consequences. No one can trademark a sound that anyone building the same machine will make, any more than a company can trademark the noise of rain. The legal battle ground on for roughly 6 years, and in the year 2000, after all that time and expense, Harley-Davidson withdrew the application. It never got the trademark. Here is where the story pays off the thing it planted 70 years earlier, and the plant deserves to be named directly. The sound had first become an asset by accident, a byproduct of the V-twin geometry the company adopted in its racing years, amplified by the liberator and the outlaw into the audible signature of American freedom. For 7 decades, it had been the company's most distinctive possession and had cost the company nothing, because it was free, given away by the physics to anyone who built the engine the same way. And that was exactly why the company could not own it. The very thing that made the sound valuable, that it was the true, mechanical voice of a real engine architecture, was the thing that made it impossible to fence off, because the architecture belonged to engineering, not to Milwaukee. The most valuable asset Harley-Davidson had was a feeling attached to a noise. And a feeling attached to a noise cannot be registered, defended, or sold like a patent. The company had tried to own the sound of America, and it had learned, at the cost of 6 years of litigation, that some assets are powerful precisely because no one can own them. The belief was worth everything. The belief was also, legally, worth nothing. And the machine that made the sound was about to face a future in which its most loyal believers were growing old, and a new kind of Harley was being built that made no sound at all. Chapter 13. The sound fades. The problem arrived quietly, in the demographics, and it was the kind of problem no tariff and no trademark could touch. The customer who bought a Harley-Davidson to buy his way into a myth was, by definition, a customer for whom the myth already meant something, and the myth meant the most to the men who had grown up with the liberator and the outlaw, who were now growing old. In 1987, around half of Harley riders had been under the age of 35. By 2006, only about 15% were, and the median age of a Harley buyer had climbed to the mid-40s and kept climbing. The company had built its recovery on selling identity to affluent middle-aged men, and the strategy worked brilliantly right up until those men began to age out of motorcycling and no comparable wave of young riders arrived to replace them. Eventually, the company stopped publicly disclosing the average age of its riders, which is the kind of decision a company makes when a number has stopped being a bragging point and started being a warning. Before the demographic problem became undeniable, the company got a sharp early warning about the danger of confusing loyalty with demand, and it came in the form of an accounting-driven stumble. In the boom years around the turn of the century, demand ran so hot that dealers kept waiting lists, and some new Harley-Davidsons sold above their sticker price, a motorcycle that appreciated the moment it left the showroom. The company expanded production to meet the frenzy. Then, in the model years around 2003 and 2004, demand softened, and it became clear that the company had been pushing more motorcycles out to its dealers than the end market could actually absorb. When that reality reached investors, the stock fell hard, from above $60 to below $40 in the spring of 2004, and the company faced shareholder lawsuits alleging it had papered over slowing demand. It was the same lesson the bicycle line had taught in 1923 and AMF had taught in the 1970s, in yet another costume. The brand's loyalty was real, but it was not infinite, and treating a passionate customer base as an unlimited well of demand was a way to get badly hurt. The company would later memorialize its own history in a $75 million museum that opened in Milwaukee in 2008, a monument to the myth on the banks of the valley where the machines were made. The myth was worth a museum. The business underneath it was harder to keep filling. The 2 decades that followed were a series of attempts to solve that problem, and many of them failed in instructive ways. In 2008, as the financial crisis hit, the brand's estimated value fell sharply, by one measure around 43% in a single year, to something over $4 billion, and the company's efforts to diversify beyond the aging core kept running into the same wall. It bought the Italian motorcycle maker MV Agusta in 2008 for around $109 million, an attempt to reach a different kind of rider, and then sold it back to its former owner in 2010 for a reported €3, having put tens of millions of dollars into the business in between, effectively paying a man to take the company off its hands. It expanded manufacturing and sales into India, chasing the growth the American market could no longer provide, and then in 2020 it pulled out of Indian manufacturing and sales entirely, taking restructuring charges on the retreat. Each move was a version of the same search, for a customer who was not an aging American buying a myth. Each move struggled, because the myth was the product, and the myth did not travel or translate as easily as the balance sheet needed it to. And then came the deepest irony the company has yet produced, the one that closes the loop the whole story has been circling. Facing a future of tightening emissions rules and a market moving toward electric power, Harley-Davidson developed an electric motorcycle, and eventually spun the effort into a separate brand called Livewire. The electric Harley is, by most measures, a genuinely capable machine. It is fast, clean, and modern, and it makes almost no sound at all. The company that had spent 6 years in federal court trying to legally own the potato of its V-twin now had a flagship future product whose defining acoustic quality was near silence. The sound of America, if the company's own electric future is any guide, may end up being no sound. Livewire has struggled as a business. It lost around $94 million in 2024 and projected sales of only 1,000 to 2,000 electric motorcycles for the following year, which shows how hard it is to sell a Harley-Davidson to people who were never buying the machine in the first place. They were buying the sound, and the meaning, and the myth. And an electric motorcycle offers the machine while surrendering the one asset that was never really about the machine. The core business, meanwhile, kept shrinking against its aging base. In 2024, Harley-Davidson sold around 149,000 motorcycles, down roughly 17% from the year before, a serious decline for a company whose central problem remained the same one it had faced in 2006, not enough new riders to replace the old ones. In 2025, the long-serving chief executive, Jochen Zeitz, announced his retirement, and the search for a successor became entangled in a boardroom fight, as an activist investment firm that held a stake in the company launched a public campaign against the board, arguing that leadership had failed to reverse the decline. A manufacturer that had survived 2 world wars, a depression, a conglomerate, and a near bankruptcy, was now fighting over its own board while its sales fell and its riders aged. The founding families were long gone from control. What remained was the name, the myth, and the sound, still valuable enough that sophisticated investors would wage a public war over who got to steward them. And yet, for all of it, the aging customer, the failed diversifications, the boardroom war, the silent electric future, Harley-Davidson in the present day remains something almost no company in this story's frame of reference remains. It is still independent. It was never absorbed permanently into a larger firm, never broken up and sold for parts, never reduced to a badge licensed by a foreign owner. It still trades on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker it took from its own former insult, Hog. And it is still headquartered on Juneau Avenue in Milwaukee, the same street, renamed, where 4 young men put up a wooden factory in 1906, a few steps from where the 10 by 15-foot shed once stood. A company that has nearly died more times than most companies live is still there, on the original street, making the machine and, for now, still making the sound. Whether the sound survives the machine that made it is the question the company is living inside right now. It is also, if the last 120 years are any guide, exactly the wrong question. The machine was never the point. The sound was never really about the engine. The thing that survived every catastrophe was never the product at all. Conclusion. Consider the whole inventory, laid out cold. A motorcycle that could not climb a hill, built in a shed 10 feet by 15 by a draftsman, a pattern maker, and 2 railroad men. A perfect score in an endurance run that turned reliability into a reputation. A V-twin engine that won on the board tracks and left behind an uneven, loping sound as a byproduct nobody designed. The only American motorcycle maker to survive the Great Depression, kept alive by delivery tricycles and industrial engines. 75,000 machines built for the Second World War, 30,000 of them shipped to Stalin, and a name, the Liberator, earned in the mud of a liberated continent. An outlaw image the company never wanted and could not have bought. A rejection by the Japanese that the machine could not answer on price or performance. A sale to a company that made bowling equipment, and a decade that turned the brand into a punchline. A buyback financed almost entirely with debt, 4 days from bankruptcy, saved by a loan signed on New Year's Eve. A recovery built by copying the Japanese factory. And, at the end of it, a 6-year federal lawsuit fought to try to own a noise. And lost. The business story is not in any of those events by itself. It is in the gap between two things that ran side by side through all of them. On one side, the company, a mid-sized American manufacturer that made a mechanically conservative motorcycle, that fell behind its competitors on the actual product for decades at a stretch, and that came within days of ceasing to exist on more than one occasion. On the other side, the name, an asset so valuable that 13 executives borrowed $80 million to reclaim it, that turned its own insult into a stock ticker, and that a company would spend 6 years in court trying to protect down to the sound its engines made. The company was ordinary and repeatedly almost fatal. The name was extraordinary and nearly indestructible. Everything interesting in this history happens in the distance between them. Look at the decisions, each one a market problem answered. The endurance run answered the question of whether the machine could be trusted. The V-twin answered the question of whether it could win. The war contracts answered the question of who would buy at scale. The Servicar answered the question of how to survive when no one was buying at all. The outlaw image, uninvited, answered the question of what the machine would mean. The Japanese-style factory answered the question of how to build it right. And the sound trademark tried, and failed, to answer the question of whether the meaning could be owned like property. Now look at the errors, each one a business decision made once and paid for later. The company that begged for a tariff in 1952 revealed an instinct to solve a competitive problem with a wall instead of a product. An instinct it did not fully unlearn until it handed the wall back in 1987. The sale to AMF answered a real need for capital by surrendering the product to people who did not understand what made it valuable, and the price of that error was a decade of ruined quality and a reputation that had to be rebuilt from a punchline. Not everything about the AMF years was decline, and the exception matters because it carried the seed of the recovery. Willie G. Davidson, a grandson of one of the founders and a trained stylist, ran the company's design during this period, and where the conglomerate's managers saw units and volumes, he saw the machines as objects of desire. In 1971, he did something quietly decisive. He took a big twin engine, mated it to the lighter front end of the smaller Sportster, styled the result, and called it the Superglide. It was the first of what the industry would come to call the factory custom, a production motorcycle built to look like the machines riders were customizing in their garages, the choppers and cruisers of the era. It sold on style and attitude rather than specification, and it pointed directly at the strategy that would eventually save the company. Sell the identity, build the machine the myth demands. Even as AMF stamped its own initials on the fuel tanks above the Harley-Davidson name, and even as the quality collapsed around him, Willie G. Davidson kept the design soul of the company alive. When the executives finally bought the company back, they would build the recovery on exactly the insight his Superglide had proven a decade early. The conglomerate had nearly killed the product. It had not managed to kill the idea of the product. The strategy of selling identity to affluent middle-aged men worked so well that the company kept selling it right up to the point where those men grew old and no replacement generation had been cultivated to take their place. Each error was rational in its moment. Each one came due. Why did the name survive when the company so often nearly did not? Because the name meant something exact, and the meaning was paid for in events that could not be faked. The Liberator meaning was paid for in a world war. The reliability meaning was paid for in a 1,000-point endurance run. The outlaw meaning was paid for by a subculture the company did not create and a sound it did not design. That precision, the fact that the myth pointed at specific, real history, is what made it worth $80 million in debt to reclaim and 6 years of litigation to defend. And it is also what made it impossible to own. because the sound at the center of it belonged to the physics of the engine, free to anyone, exactly as the meaning belonged to the history, free to everyone who lived it. If you want to understand how a name outlasts the company that carries it, how a sound can become worth more than the machine that makes it, and what it costs to try to own a feeling the whole world can already hear, Harley-Davidson is the case to study.